Today, for our sermon, I figured that we would focus on something a little different before we go into our next sermon series for the summer. We're going to be going through the book of Exodus in the summer, right off the heels of looking at part of Genesis. But as I said, before we do that, I want to focus on something a little different, maybe kind of push pause a little bit on things, and talk about how we have responded and how we are responding to the pandemic that has been a part of our life now for about a quarter of a year already, locally. And so as we look at 2020 so far, 2020 we would maybe say has not been the best year of our lives. Maybe that would be something we could at least say, well, not the best. That might be an understatement as we can think about many of things that have happened this year that have not been the best. However, we do know that there have been things that have been positive that have happened. There have been good things that have occurred this year. It's just that a lot of those things are overshadowed, and perhaps rightly so. But many of the good things have been overshadowed by some of the things that have been quite unexpected. Things that have taken over the news and that we hear about 24/7, which obviously the pandemic is one of them, that we have heard time in and time out. Most recently, however, we also are faced with a new thing that has been happening in recent weeks, where we've had another instance of police brutality, where a police officer murdered an African-American man. And that has resulted in protests around the nation, in fact around the world, not just our nation. Some of the protests, many of them have been peaceful, and some of them, there have been people within those protests who started turning them into violent protests, destruction of property, hurting other people, and in some cases resulting in more life that has been lost. And the protests are continuing on. They're becoming more peaceful just recently at the time of our recording of the worship service, but they are continuing on in some shape or fashion. And so one of the vows that we take as members of the United Methodist Church, if you are a member of the United Methodist Church, you took the membership vows. And for some of you that might have been a long time ago, and maybe for some of you that's in recent memory and you can remember those. But one of the vows that we take as United Methodists is that we will resist evil, injustice, and oppression in whatever forms they present themselves. And evil and injustice and oppression present themselves in many different forms, some of them obvious and some of them maybe not so obvious. But racism is definitely a form of evil, injustice, and oppression. And so when this happened, when this man was killed, many people are protesting because they are angry. You know, they're angry, they're outraged, and rightly so. It would be enough for them to be angry because of the death of somebody, but even more so, they are protesting what they see as systematic racism that is baked within our culture in America. And so they are protesting many things. But as Methodists, we want to condemn evil, injustice, and oppression in whatever forms they present themselves. So that takes the place of this instance that we saw where a person was killed. We also see and condemn any violence, hurting of other people, destruction of property as a result, while at the same time acknowledging that for many of these people, even those who are protesting violently, that for a lot of people, when they get to that point, it is because they have felt unheard and invalidated for so long that it reaches a boiling point. And it doesn't necessarily excuse violence, but we can see underneath that something that has been seething for a long time. And we see that many people have felt unheard and felt that their problems have not been validated as being real. And many people perhaps feel that other ways that they have tried to protest in the past, whether it be marching or kneeling, have been met by disdain, and also just a sense that the problems that they experience on a regular basis are not really there. And that many people proclaim, well, it's not really there. There is no problem. What's your problem? what are you complaining about? And so finally it reached this boiling point, and many people are responding to that in many different ways. Some of them helpful, and some of them not so helpful. But as we continue on, realizing and recognizing this evil, injustice, oppression, whatever you want to call it, that is inherent in our culture, we want to do what we can as United Methodists to work for peace, to work for understanding, to work to listen to other people who are different from us, to listen to their experiences and not to assume that we know what they are experiencing, and to work towards reconciliation. I know that we all hope and pray that we would come to a point to where there would be peace and reconciliation, knowing that we don't live in a perfect world and we won't find probably complete reconciliation anytime soon, but we can work towards that goal. And so may God be with us as a nation and as around the world as we continue to listen and to learn to others. But that's one of the most recent developments this year. But getting back to the pandemic, we see that this is something that's been going on for quite a while. It started for us in March, but of course it started a long time before March. But for us in Iowa, it really hit home in March. March 15th is when we had our last in-person worship service, already coming upon 3 months ago, a quarter of a year. And that's when, about the same time that schools started closing in our state. It is the time that we stopped our in-person worship services. Most businesses closed. Much of society closed. And after that point, as a church, we had to respond quickly, of course. And what we did at first is we just canceled everything. We just canceled everything except worship. We moved worship online. That was really a pretty easy thing to do because we were already recording worship services. So it was just a matter of putting the service online. We already had the sermons online, so we just put the whole service online in the different digital spaces, website, Facebook, YouTube. But, nonetheless, we have our volunteers who've had to be flexible and be willing to come earlier in the week to record services to make that happen. And so we're very appreciative of them for all their work and effort as well. But we pretty much canceled everything else at first. And then as time went on and we realized, this is going to be more than a few weeks, we figured out how to do committee meetings, Bible studies, and fellowship online as well. We continue to serve in our community, in some ways the same, some ways different. We continue to support our food pantry and other such places of charity in our community. We are now hosting the summer feeding program, which was going to happen anyway, but now it's grab and go, and so we're glad that we can do that. People in our congregation, I know, have been sewing masks, just helping out in different ways. But every aspect of our life as a church has changed. Even funerals have changed. As we now, with the pandemic, funerals are much smaller, much more private. We have had 2 people in our congregation at Harlan first pass away since this started, Darlene Hylison and Jean Friend. And for other people who may not be in the family, it's hard because there is no funeral to go to. Oftentimes it's a private family gravesite, or if they have a funeral service, it's still relegated to family. And so it's hard for people to say goodbye or to not attend a funeral. But we remember that Darlene Hylison and Jean Friend were both women of strong faith who had much to offer, and they served many people in many different ways in their lifetime. We remember that they leave behind not only memories for those who knew them, but also an example for us to follow in our own lives. But it's taken another adjustment for us as we say goodbye to people in different ways. So just about every aspect has been affected. Now, since this time, when this first happened in March, many places are opening back up, and so life is returning a little bit more to normal, so to speak. But the pandemic is still here. And so the question is, how do we continue to respond as a church to this new reality that we live in, as we seem to realize that this is going to last longer than initially we had thought, and we're not sure how long it's going to last. You know, people give different predictions. Some people are saying we could have 100 million doses of vaccine available by January. That would be wonderful. Or some people are saying it could be later, so we really don't want to mark it on our calendars yet and say we know exactly when a vaccine is going to be here. But as a church, how do we respond? Well, I'm going to talk first about logistics and secondly about theology, how we respond faithfully as Christians. So some of this stuff you might have heard of in different avenues, but I've never really spoken about it from a worship service standpoint. But our Conference of the United Methodist Church, which is the statewide body of the United Methodist Church, has come out with a 3-phased reopening plan. And this is based on experts in the fields of infectious disease. And so, we believe that we need to look to medical experts when we look at what it means to reopen, because we realize that we are not medical experts. Maybe Roger is, but most of us are not medical experts, and so we don't know. I haven't dedicated my life to infectious diseases. I have trained to be a pastor, and therefore I don't want to claim that I know what is the best way to go about things. So that's why we in the conference are looking to those who have dedicated their lives to these types of things. So this 3-phased approach is kind of like a stoplight. It's got red, yellow, green. I will not explain to you what those colors mean. I'm going to assume that you know what those colors mean. So first is red, which means stop, right? So we kind of stop everything in person in the red phase. We've been in the red phase since March 15th, and we continue to be in this phase. I won't really explain it. It's pretty self-explanatory. We've been living through it for a while now. And then there's the yellow phase, which means caution. Proceed slowly with caution. And we reach the yellow phase. The recommendation is that we wait until positive cases in our county have been decreasing for a period of 2 weeks. Not just remaining steady, not just kind of slight decline, but a noticeable decline for a period of 2 weeks or more. And when that threshold is passed, then we can look at resuming worship. And yet, when we resume in-person worship in the yellow phase, it is going to look quite different than what worship used to be. It's not returning to life as normal, but with certain guidelines in place to keep people as safe as we possibly can and to protect the vulnerable in our community. So, what worship would look like would be a little different, of course, in our 2 different churches. But when you come to church, the capacity of our sanctuary would be reduced from what it has been, because we would want to do what we can to distance family groups 6 feet or more. And so at Harlan first, we would have places in the sanctuary that would be marked as seating areas. And in Monroe Chapel, we would probably meet in the fellowship hall because that would give us more space to socially distance. But we would have places, in particular at Harlan First, where you would be marked. It would be marked where you could sit. And you would need to let us know if you plan to come to worship. That way we would kind of have an idea of how many to expect. And that way we don't have to have a surprise and have to cap it off and say, well, I'm sorry, we're full. We would hate to have to turn people away. And so you would come in and we would encourage you to bring a mask. In fact, we are requiring masks at that point. And so we would really encourage you, if you have a mask at home, to bring it. If you don't have one, we are hoping to have disposable masks on hand that you can use when you get there. But I would say don't rely on that every week, otherwise we're going to have to be buying a bunch of disposable masks in bulk constantly. So bring a mask if you have one. If you don't, we can provide one for you. And if you don't have a mask, you may need to worship in a different room, and we really don't want to have to do that. But they say that masks really do greatly decrease the possibility of transmission. So we really want to be careful about that, especially if we're gathering in a large group. And so you would wear a mask, and all touchable items would be removed. So pews, pew Bibles, pencils, paper, stuff like that would be removed from the pews. Offering would be taken at the end of the service, as we started doing in March before we stopped altogether. And we would not be participating in congregational singing or liturgical responses, unison prayers, things of that nature, because it has been shown that the virus can spread much further than 6 feet when we are singing or speaking loudly. And so even with a mask. And so as a congregation, we would not be doing those things. Now, people in the front area at Harlan First anyway, for sure, would be able to sing music because there is a 12-foot distance, and we are able to maintain a 12-foot distance between us and the congregation, and that's what they recommend, is a 12-foot distance for that. So we would be able to have music in worship. It's just that we would not be encouraging you, the congregation, to sing during worship. And so, there are a lot of things in place there. And even with that, we would still encourage people over 65 or with underlying health conditions to stay home and worship virtually. And so there's a lot of restrictions in place there. And I know that some people have said, well, if that's the way we do worship, I'd rather just worship at home. At least at home I can sing and it can be more worshipful versus being at church and not being able to do those things. We would encourage people not to visit with one another very much, or if so, to maintain 6-foot distance, or to go outside to talk to each other. It's a lot safer to visit outside. But we'd be doing the opposite of everything we've been taught to do, and that is we would not be encouraging people to linger and mill around after the service, but we'd be saying skedaddle, and that's just so much the opposite of what we want to do and we want to be able to do, and that's why we have been certainly cautious about returning to in-person worship, as well as the fact that we're not ready, we're not in the yellow phase yet. But some people have said, I don't know that I want to worship that way. And that's a very valid point. But the reality is that the yellow phase is going to last for several months. And that we would probably be in that phase in some form or fashion until there is a vaccine. And so the fact is that probably at some point here, we're going to be returning to in-person worship. And when we do, for those who come, for those who decide to come, it will look a lot different than what we're used to. They are saying, as I said earlier, that this pandemic could last quite a while. Altogether, it could last a year or two. And they are also predicting that in the fall and winter, there could be a spike. Things might look like they may be improving right now, but there could be a spike that could be worse than what we have seen so far. I don't say that to discourage you. I don't say that to scare you or to sound like just being depressing or anything like that, but I say that to simply acknowledge that it appears as though this is with us and will be with us longer than we maybe thought, and it will be affecting our lives longer than we thought. But it will not last forever. They will come up with a vaccine. That they are pretty sure of. They're already making good progress on vaccines and going into at least second stage of trials and things of that nature. And so, as I said, we're pretty optimistic that we will come out with a vaccine, and this will come to an end. And when we get to that point, when we have a vaccine, then we will be able to return to the green phase, which means life like normal. We'll be able to worship the way that we once did. We'll be able to fellowship and have food and join together in potlucks and all these things. And I have a feeling, they talk about the quarantine 15, I think I heard recently, we might have a return to normal that will also present some challenges for us, because I have a feeling we're going to have a lot of communal meals. But, so we look forward to that time, right? And we know that it is there. It's on the horizon. We don't know how far off it is, but we know that it is there. And we are going to return to normal, even if maybe we continue to keep keep certain practices that we have picked up along the way, but we will return to that point. We will get past this. This will not last forever. Praise God. We're grateful for that. But until then, we want to be cautious. We want to take certain things into consideration. So that's just some of the logistics. We don't know all the details about timeline. We just know that we want to be careful. And now I want to talk a little bit about faith. I want to talk a little bit about our faith and how we use it to get through this time. So there are three things that I want to mention. Number one, three principles for living. Number one is faith in the midst of fear. Number two is wisdom in the midst of worry. And number three is prayer over panic. So first of all, faith in the midst of fear. So often I hear a new phrase. It's not new, we've heard it before, but it's become really popular. We hear it in a lot of places. It's called faith over fear. Right? And so we choose to live with faith over fear. And that's very good. That sounds very good. It sounds very religious. It sounds very courageous to have faith over fear. And in some context, depending on what we're talking about, that is a wonderful thing to be able to live in faith over fear. And yet, oftentimes what I hear is when some people say we need to live in faith over fear, what they mean is we need to disregard the recommendations of the experts. For many people, what that says is we need to live life as if there is no pandemic. We need to just return to normal. We don't need to do any of these things. We don't need to do any of these precautions. We just need to live in faith. And so basically this way is saying faith without fear. We shouldn't fear. We should just discourage fear and get rid of it and just have kind of a blind faith that we're going to be okay, that maybe this pandemic isn't as bad as we think, or maybe we will somehow be protected from the pandemic, but we need to live in faith over fear. Now, oftentimes this term is being used to justify having in-person worship services without the proper precautions in place, and oftentimes the same people that are using that argument are also saying, but those over 65 and those with underlying health conditions or anyone who's not comfortable being in church should stay home. Which is contradictory. Because on the one hand, you're saying we should live with faith over fear and we should just, continue life as normal, but if you don't feel comfortable with that, stay home. Well, I don't think that people are meaning to communicate this, but what that communicates is that you can stay home if you want to, but if you do, you're choosing fear over faith. You can take precautions if you want to, but if so, that means that you're a bad Christian because you don't believe strongly enough that you're going to be okay and that you can go about life as normal. And so it's a contradictory message. And it's not very realistic either, by the way, because it's not really realistic that we would be without fear at all times. In fact, I don't think we want to be without fear at all times. Fear is not inherently evil or sinful or bad. As we talked about in our Unafraid study, actually the whole point was not that we are always unafraid, but is that we live with fear. So we have fear, and sometimes fear can be a good thing because it can protect us from very real dangers. And so we don't want to live without fear, but having faith in the midst of fear is courageous. Courage is not the absence of fear. If you're not afraid of something, it's not courageous, right? It's easy, right? If I'm not afraid to do something, then there's no courage involved. But if I am afraid, if there's a part of me that has some fear involved, then I am acting with courage. And so I'm talking about living with faith in the midst of fear, and that fear is a good thing in us because it helps us to put certain practices into place. When we live with faith in the midst of fear, it means that we don't have to do things the way we've always done them because we think it's the only way to do them. We realize that we can do things in new ways. We can live out our faith in new ways that are informed by our fear. But we can continue living with courage and faith in responsible ways that protect those who are most vulnerable and protect ourselves as well. So that's one thing. Living with faith in the midst of fear It means not just cowering all the time and just being so afraid that we can't even serve other people or be a blessing to others, but it means finding creative new ways to bless others and to live out our faith and our spiritual disciplines in a way that is informed by our fear. So that's one, faith in the midst of fear. Second one is wisdom in the midst of worry. Now, worry is one of those things that is pretty much always unproductive. It's not a thing that results in anything fruitful, generally speaking. Now, sometimes worry can lead us into action and to do some things that can help a situation. Then it can be good. There's nothing about worry that's inherently sinful or evil either. It's just oftentimes it can be time that is not very productive. Because so often we worry about things that we cannot control. And so when we live with worry, we can become paralyzed. We can become incapable of living our lives and doing anything that is worthwhile. And so we want to live with worry. Worry has a function, but we don't want to be paralyzed by it. And so we want to live with wisdom. What does that mean? Well, wisdom means being wise about how we do things. So if we know that there's a problem, in this case, the pandemic, if we know that there is a problem, living with wisdom means realizing, first of all, that I don't know everything. So if I am living with wisdom, it means that I know that I don't know a lot of stuff. And so there's a saying that I like to say, the more I know, the more I realize that I don't know. Or here's how it goes. I only know enough to know that I don't know as much as I should know. And so realizing that we know certain things but not everything, we have to take into consideration the advice of other people who don't know everything, but they may know something that we don't know. You know, like I said earlier, the medical experts, people who have dedicated their lives to infectious diseases. And so we know that there are certain things, there are certain practices that can help decrease the severity of the pandemic. You know, we're not in complete control of it. No, if we were, we wouldn't be where we are now, right? So we know that we're not in complete control, and so there are some things that we cannot control. But we know, verifiably, that there are things that we can do to decrease the severity of it, to decrease the spread. And one of it is realizing that we can spread the disease when we don't even know we're sick, which is completely counterintuitive. Because we are so used to the idea that, well, I'm infectious when I'm sneezing or coughing or have a fever and all these things. We're so used to that it's hard for us to comprehend that when we feel great and we feel like 100%, that we could still have it and not know it. It's just so counterintuitive. But the experts are telling us that that is the case, and that there are actual practices that we can put into place to protect ourselves and to protect others. And so living with wisdom in the midst of worry means that, yes, sometimes we are going to worry because even though it's largely unproductive, we all do it, right? And so we are going to worry, and yet there are things that we can do to decrease the severity. There are actions that we can take. And then for the things that we don't have control over, we put in the hands of God. And I know that's something that's easier to say than to do, but we come to God in prayer. And so that brings us to our third thing, prayer over panic. We don't want to panic, right? Panic doesn't do any good. But we want to come to God in prayer for the things that we cannot control. Prayer is something that we can do wherever we are, whatever our situation is. We can pray when we're isolated. We can pray when we're alone. And when we pray for other people and other things, when we pray to God, we connect with God and we connect with others through our prayers for them. And of course, the best kind of prayers are the prayers that lead us to action. They lead us to doing things to help others. But prayer itself can be beneficial to you, and to other people, and to whatever situation it is that you're praying for. And so that is true whether we are talking about racism or whether we're talking about the pandemic or whether whatever it is that we're talking about. Prayer is a good step. And so as we continue on in this year, 2020, we're only about halfway through. And as I said, there are good things that have happened this year, and I believe that there are good things that will continue to happen this year. Look for those good things. And as we look for those good things, we can also contribute to those good things by seeking to serve others, by seeking to bless others through the things that we do creatively to make a difference in this world. But as we continue to live out this year and the years after that, may we remember that we want to live with faith in the midst of fear, wisdom in the midst of worry, and prayer over panic. Amen.